Good morning, church. We'll be reading from John 20, 24 through 31. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord," but said to them, "Unless I see the nails in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, the disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands reach out your hand and put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus performed many other signs, in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. You may be seated.
Thank you, David. It is a beautiful morning to be together, to worship God together. It's so good to see each of you. You know, believing in the unbelievable is difficult, to say the least. And the resurrection of Jesus from the dead is not an easy thing to believe. But I want to tell you today there is good reason to believe that Jesus arose from the dead. Let me tell you a story. In 1957, Lieutenant David Steves walked out of the Sierra Mountains 54 days after his jet disappeared. By this time, when he showed up alive, he'd already been pronounced dead. Now, Steves told an amazing story of survival in the wilderness. But after months of searching by the Air Force, not a piece of the wreckage was found, and his story was doubted. A more plausible rumor began to spread, saying that this traitorous pilot flew that military jet deep into Mexico and turned it over to the Russians for payment to a foreign bank account. But with the lack of hard evidence, no formal charges were ever filed. But rumors and suspicion plagued his military career until finally David Steves asked for a full discharge from the Air Force. Now, sadly, his civilian life didn't go much better. Soon after, he was divorced and lost custody of his young daughter. He lost the support of most of his friends and his family. But driven by that cloud of conspiracy hanging over his head, he would spend the rest of his life trying to comb those Sierra Mountains in a rented plane to find a piece of the wreckage to prove his story was true. Tragically, 8 years after his jet disappeared, he died in a plane crash trying to find the wreckage. And then 12 years later, a group of Boy Scouts, while backpacking in Kings Canyon, would discover a large piece of that cockpit from that Air Force jet in a shallow alpine lake. The serial number was clearly present, and it matched Lieutenant Steves' missing jet. If we're honest, those of us who are Christians can empathize with Lieutenant Steves. He had no way to prove that what happened to him was true. The same is true for us. When it comes to the resurrection and our desire to prove its trustworthiness, now there's certainly overwhelming circumstantial evidence. There is the testimony of those eyewitnesses. We can never offer any concrete evidence. We can't take a person back to that tomb, show them that the tomb is empty. We can't somehow reenact the resurrection with resurrection appearances of Jesus. We can't take them to Jesus and say, "See, here he is. He's alive. But you know, even if we could build an airtight case, there are some friends and family members who would still not believe. Today I want us to experience the resurrection of Jesus through the eyes of a skeptic. The man's name has become synonymous with doubting and disbelief, even though he was one of Jesus' original 12 apostles. His name is Thomas. He's been nicknamed Doubting Thomas. Probably not a very fair nickname for a guy. He is a person like many of us. He just needed more proof. We find his story in John chapter 20. And at this point in the story that David read for us just a couple of minutes ago, at this point in the story, Jesus has been resurrected from the dead. And he's already appeared to the women at the tomb and then to 10 of the 12 apostles. But unfortunately, Thomas wasn't with them that evening when he appeared to the other apostles. They told Thomas, "We have seen the Lord." And then Thomas said those famous words, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it." Can you identify with Thomas? Would you have said the same thing if you had been there? I can identify with him. Certainly, seeing is believing. But before we're too hard on Thomas, I think it's important that we try to take into consideration that he and so many were going through many things at that time. Several factors were creating a basis for his disbelief. And these same kind of things can affect our faith as well. First of all, he was likely experiencing despair. Thomas, like the rest of Jesus' followers, had just endured a very traumatic event. The person that they had invested 3 years of their lives into, a person they dearly loved, had just suffered a gruesome death. It was very vividly portrayed by Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. If any of you saw that, it was a brutal, gruesome death. But that day, Thomas lost not only one of his best friends, Thomas lost his purpose for living. The world came crumbling down around him that day, and I'm sure he could not see beyond the rubble at that point. And maybe you've experienced a loss like that in your life. And if you haven't, then you someday might. The pain and despair of those moments can be so bad that you lose hope that anything good can ever happen in your life again. Maybe you can relate. But on top of the despair Thomas felt that day, he was likely experiencing a disappointment with God. Like all of Jesus' disciples, Thomas was a godly man. He was one of those hand-picked by Jesus for leadership in the church that would begin. And I'm sure over the 3 years of his ministry, Thomas had placed all his trust in Jesus. Like most of the followers of Jesus, Thomas expected that Jesus was the one who would kick the Romans out of their land and restore Israel as a prominent nation once again. Thomas expected Jesus to be the King of the Jews, who would bring the kingdom of God to the earth. So can you imagine his disillusionment when Jesus was crucified? Can you imagine how his hopes and dreams died with Jesus on the cross? Can you imagine how he was indeed disappointed with God? He had thought that Jesus was the Messiah, the one he'd been waiting for, the one Israel had been waiting for centuries. And God somehow pulled the rug out from under him. He was indeed disappointed. Now, some of us have likely been where Thomas was at some point because we've experienced a disappointment with God in our lives. Maybe it was some disappointing experience like you'd prayed about something for a long time that never materialized. Or perhaps you've experienced tragedies and pain that just leave you mystified. Perhaps you've wondered if God is really with you or is on your side. Maybe you've wondered if God is really there at all. Our disappointment with God can drive us to cynicism and skepticism and total unbelief. An important thing for us to realize is that disappointment with God is often misplaced. See, like Thomas, we sometimes set ourselves up for disappointment because we're expecting something from God that He has not promised. Thomas was expecting Jesus would set up an earthly kingdom. Is that what Jesus had promised? No, that's not what He'd promised. Years ago, I talked with someone who at a young age had lost both of his parents. And with real anger in his voice, he said this to me. He said, both my parents went to church all the time, and if going to church doesn't get you anything, then why go? You hear the disappointment? But you hear how he had a mistaken expectation. See, he had assumed that God kind of has this contract that says, if you go to church all the time, nothing will ever happen to you. Is that the contract that God has laid before us? Is that the promise? No. I suggested to that person that perhaps his parents didn't feel like God had let them down. Perhaps they understood that walking with God didn't guarantee anything in this world. See, God's greatest purposes and blessings are for the next world, not this one. And we set ourselves up for a fall when we expect something from God that He has not promised. If we've experienced trials and losses, or if we're going through them right now, I want to encourage us to not give up on God. Take our pain, take our disappointment and disillusionment and despair, and take them to God. The thing He has promised is that He'll be with us and that He will help us through our trials. And God can do a beautiful work in our souls through the pain and the difficulties we face. Whatever we do, we must not let our disappointment with God drive us into disbelief. In addition to despair and disappointment, Thomas was also experiencing a distance from God's people. Did you notice Thomas was conspicuously absent when Jesus appeared the first time to the other disciples? Where was he that night? Why was everyone else together and he wasn't with them? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us why Thomas was absent, but I wonder if he was deliberately isolating himself from others. In that way, he might perfectly fit into our culture today, right? Where we don't need anybody. We can handle everything all by ourselves. Like many of us, Thomas didn't take seriously Jesus' instructions about community. Being together as Christ's community isn't just something that we can do, it's ultimately something that we must do. Being with the assembly isn't just an option, it's an opportunity. It's an obligation. Jesus said, where 2 or 3 come together in my name, there I am with them. Matthew 18 and verse 20. And so when we are together, Jesus is with us. Together we experience the Lord in a clearer and more intimate way than any of us can experience all by ourselves in isolation. And if at any point we feel disconnected from God, we must ask ourselves, have I become disconnected from the people of God? We cannot truly be connected with God without being connected with God's people. And so, brothers and sisters, we need to take this seriously. We, like Thomas, can move into disbelief if we remove ourselves from the fellowship of God's people. Almost without exception, people who move into a lifestyle of sin or disbelief have moved out of the spiritual community. When Christians begin to distance themselves from the church, they are usually headed down the wrong road. And that's why the Bible tells us repeatedly about the importance of coming together, like Hebrews 10, 24 and 25, and let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. And let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, But let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see that day approaching. And then Hebrews 3:13, but encourage one another daily as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. Now, to Thomas's credit, he returned to the spiritual community, and then his doubts turned into belief. 1 week later, on that first day of the week, Sunday, the disciples were together again, and this time Thomas was with them. John writes there in verse 28, though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. And he said to Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Thomas exclaimed, and you can hear the choke in his voice, my Lord and my God. In that moment, Thomas got it. He declared something that he had been doubting. Jesus is Lord, and he is God. Now here's a great truth that hits me in this story. Jesus was willing to answer Thomas's questions. Jesus was willing to relieve his doubts. And because Jesus was God, he knew exactly what Thomas had said publicly that week before. He knew exactly what Thomas had said would convince him that Jesus was the risen Christ. And he offered Thomas that very proof. Right? Thomas, you said, unless you touched my hand, put your hand into my side, you would not believe. Well, go ahead. And that's how God works. He wants people to transition from doubting to believing. Now, certainly there are things that God won't do to prove himself today. And yet God does things. He shows he's real. He shows he's alive. And although he gave a special gift to Thomas that day, he blesses us today in a different way. And that's why he said to Thomas, he said, because you have seen me, you've believed, but blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. We're those people, aren't we? We weren't there that day. That day was a long time ago. And yet we believe. And so what evidence do we have to help turn doubters into believers? Well, a first big piece of evidence is we have an empty tomb. Jesus' dead body has never been presented as evidence. It's never been brought forward. Here he is. He didn't rise from the dead. The tomb is still empty. Number two, we have the testimony of those who saw him alive. They were willing to die for that testimony. Most of those early disciples, those apostles, gave their life for the testimony that he is alive. Number three, we have the Word of God. It tells us so many of the events and teachings of Jesus, including the resurrection, including those appearances over that 40-day period to over 500 of the believers in addition to those apostles. Of course, the Apostle John tells us that he's not trying to tell us everything that Jesus did. He said, you imagine how big that book would be, right? But the things that have been written so that we might believe, and that by believing we would experience life in his name. One final piece of evidence I would share is changed lives. Believing in the risen Christ has transforming power for the life of the one who believes. And that was true of those early believers. And that's true of believers throughout time. Of course, I stand here today, and you're likely sitting here today as one of those people who's been transformed because we believe in the risen Christ. Millions of people over these past 2,000 years have a similar testimony. Some years ago, an influential Christian leader named Clarence Jordan said, the most convincing evidence of Jesus' resurrection was not an empty tomb. It was the life-filled disciple community. Not a rolled away stone, but a carried away church. And I like that. And his book, Has Christianity Failed You? Ravi Zacharias points to one of the greatest proofs of the truth of Christ and the reality of his resurrection. It is the changed lives of Christians. He writes this, listen, during the course of nearly 40 years, I've traveled to virtually every continent, have seen or heard some of the most amazing testimonies of God's intervention in the most extreme circumstances. I have seen hardened criminals touched by the message of Jesus Christ and their hearts turned toward good in a way that no amount of rehabilitation could have accomplished. I've seen ardent followers of radical belief systems turn from being violent, brutal terrorists to becoming mild, tender-hearted followers of Jesus Christ. I've seen nations where the gospel, banned and silenced by governments, has nevertheless conquered the ethos and mindset of an entire culture. Then Zacharias lists a few of those examples. He says, in the middle of the 20th century, after destroying all the Christian seminary libraries in the country, Chairman Mao declared, Christianity has been permanently removed from China, never to make a return. However, we know the rest of that story, right? On Easter Sunday in 2009, the leading English newspaper in Hong Kong published a picture of Tiananmen Square on page 1 with Jesus' picture replacing Chairman Mao's picture and a gigantic banner with the words, Christ is risen. He writes, I've also been to the Middle East and marveled at the commitment of young people who have risked their lives to attend a Bible study. I've talked to CEOs of large companies in Islamic nations who testify to seeing Jesus in visions and dreams and wonder what it all means. God's doing something in that part of the world for sure. The British author A.N. Wilson, who only a few years ago was known for his scathing attacks on Christianity, celebrated Easter in 2009 in a church with a group of other church members, proclaiming that the story of Jesus of the Gospels is the only story that makes sense out of life and its challenges. Wilson said, my own return to faith has surprised none more than myself. My belief has come about in large measure because of the lives and examples of people I've known, not the famous, not the saints, but friends and relations who have lived and faced death in the light of the resurrection story or in the quiet acceptance that they have a future after they die. See, the transformation of the lives of people who believe in the risen Jesus is one of the most powerful evidences that the resurrection is true. Now, some may still wonder why the resurrection of Jesus matters so much. Let me explain why it's important in this way. The resurrection of Jesus means he is who he claimed to be. The resurrection of Jesus means that he has the power that he claimed to have. The resurrection of Jesus means that he did what he promised to do. We will go to Jerusalem. I'll be handed over to the chief priests. I'll be crucified. And on the third day, I will rise from the dead. The resurrection matters because it means that my past is forgiven. The resurrection matters because it means that my present problems can be managed by the power of God. The resurrection matters because it means that my future hope is secure, and so is yours if you believe in the risen Christ. I hope and pray that all our doubts will be turned into faith. I pray that we'll clearly see that Jesus is our Lord and our God. And I pray that because of our faith, we will offer our lives to him. And of course, someday, maybe very soon, every doubt about the reality of the resurrection will be removed. Because Jesus not only said, I'll be crucified and I'll rise from the dead, but he said, I will return. And someday he will. And every eye will see him. And he will come in the clouds. And at that moment, everyone will know the truth. And for some, it'll be too late. because they hadn't put their faith in Jesus before then. I pray that it won't be too late for any one of us. In Romans 14, verse 9 and following, Paul wrote, "For this very reason Christ died and returned to life, so that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. For we will all stand before God's judgment seat. It is written, 'As I live, says the Lord, every knee will bow before me, every tongue will confess to God.' So then each of us will give an account of himself to God." That day is coming when Jesus will return and every knee will bow. But he died and was resurrected that we might stand in God's grace and receive salvation. Let's put our faith in Jesus, his death, burial, his resurrection, so that we can stand in God's grace and experience life. Abundant life now and eternal life